we interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Hi, folks. Hello, Brian. Thank you for having me on the show. My name is Leo Silva. I was an agent with DEA for 28 years. 10 of those years were spent in Mexico, specifically Monterrey, Mexico, which is on the northern side of Mexico, a 2-hour drive from the border to Texas. My mission when I was in Monterrey was to dismantle the Zetas cartel. And that was one of the first missions that I had when I got there and I arrived in Monterrey in 2007. The Zetas cartel is one of the most brutal cartels ever to exist. They practically took over the entire country of Mexico, and they instilled terror in not only Monterrey, the Monterrey area, but all of Mexico and the United States as well. So that was our mission. I just recently wrote a book about that, and it's called Reign of Terror, and we'll be talking about that today with Brian. So yeah, I'm glad to be on here, guys.
Yes, yeah, I appreciate you making time for me like that. One of the things I want to get into is when people talk about cartels, and they often mix it up with gangs or what are referred to as street gangs or
Right.
prison gangs. If you can just explain to people a simple terms of what the cartel is and its tentacles and how it reaches out.
Sure. Basically, the cartel is organized crime. It's just another word for organized crime, and they use every means possible to generate income for their organization, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, kidnappings, prostitution, all those things that they use to generate income. And recently, one of the things that has been very lucrative for the cartels is the stealing of oil from companies, major oil companies like Pemex, which is the only company in Mexico, and they steal the crude oil and resell it for a huge, significant profit. So all of these things, the cartels are mixed up in. They have their hands in everything. They have protection rackets, everything you can think of to make money. Those guys are in it. And if you don't pay, there will be extreme consequences, for the business owners and people that are trying to make a living out there. They extort them with protection fees and stuff like that. So they're very organized. They have an intelligence network that's really, really sophisticated. And, they have policemen in their pockets, government officials. They have everybody in their pockets that can facilitate their operations.
So when Zetas first started, they have a very different origin, I think, from other cartels in the sense that they were already a trained military force or had been trained in the military.
Correct.
Am I right on that? Or if you can kind of elaborate on their history?
Sure. So the way they originated, the Gulf Cartel's leader at the time was a guy named Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, and he was the leader of the Gulf Cartel. Now, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén was a very paranoid individual, and to enhance that paranoia, he was a cocaine user. So his paranoia was extreme, and he was always afraid of somebody, going after him to kill him. He was always looking over his shoulder. So he wanted to hire the best of the best as his protection detail. And one of the first persons he hired was a guy named Arturo Guzman de Sena, who was known as Z1. He was the first one, and he was a deserter from the special forces of the Mexican army. And Ociel liked him, and he said, I want more guys like you. Find me more guys like you. So Arturo Guzman went out and recruited 30 other guys, lured them with money, and a lot of those guys had deserted. A lot of those guys were still active, but they weren't making a lot of money in the army, in the Mexican army. So they lured them with double or triple their pay, what they were earning in the army. And they came on and they became Ociel Cárdenas's protection detail. And they were assigned to protect him and eliminate his enemies. And you're talking about highly trained individuals, guys that were special forces. Now, there's a lot of myths out there and rumors stating that they were trained by the U.S. military. That's kind of a myth. The way it works is the U.S. military actually trains high-ranking generals from the Mexican military, and then they in turn train the younger recruits that are in special forces. So did they receive U.S. training directly? No. I mean, indirectly they did. I mean, because their higher ups were trained by U.S. special forces. So that's how it works. And these guys were highly trained, specializing in explosives, counterintelligence, just highly trained individuals, snipers, guys that were
Mhm.
not just guys off the street. These
Yeah.
guys, think about 30 guys that are highly trained protecting the leader of the Gulf Cartel. That's who the Zetas were. And the reason they were called Zetas, Zeta is the last letter of the alphabet. And in Spanish, the letter Z is pronounced Zeta. So that was basically their call sign. So you had Z1, Z2, Z3, and you go on down the line. And that's how it worked. And that's why they were called the Zetas. And they were originally Ociel Cárdenas Guillen's protection detail.
And so from that, they started. It's kind of like I talk about like when officers do off-duty work. So like a patrol officer can be in a uniform, get hired by some establishment to work off duty in the capacity of trying to keep the peace at that establishment or that event or whatever. And there's, stories of, probably one of the bigger cases of something like that happening is out in with the LAPD and Rampart, probably now 20, 30 years ago, but where some officers were working a security detail for Suge Knight and Death Row Records. And eventually they were, embroiled in entire corruption cases and murder and that sort of thing. I wonder with like this detail guarding cartel members, but then learning from that, like almost like they're being infected by this criminal element to the point where they probably or they do actually listening to you is like they actually start to learn the business and start to realize they themselves could become their own cartel in essence. Is that right?
Absolutely. And what happened is shortly after they were formed, there was a lot of pressure to by the United States to capture Ociel Cárdenas Guillen. If I back up a little bit, Ociel Cárdenas Guillen at one point stopped a DEA agent and an FBI agent in a city in Mexico, Matamoros, which is on the border with Brownsville, Texas. So they stopped these two agents. They were about ready to kill them. I mean, they surrounded their car at gunpoint. The agents were able to talk their way out of it and returned to the United States quickly and reported the incident. So once that incident happened, the United States put a lot of pressure on the Mexican government to go after Ociel Cárdenas Guillen with all they had. So that's what happened. And there was a lot of pressure on Ociel, and eventually he got captured in 1993. So after he was captured, I mean, not 19, I'm sorry, 2003 is when Ociel Cárdenas was captured. So once he was captured, there was a vacuum in the leadership within the Gulf Cartel. And that's when the Zetas started seeing an opportunity and seeing, hey, we can run this ourselves. We don't need Ociel. We don't need a leader. We can do this on our own. And they had so much firepower. They were highly trained. They were skilled. And basically that's what happened. They ended up taking over the business from the Gulf Cartel and all their territories as well.
And so when they did that, they started to spread out. Is that when you became involved with them, or when did you start to get involved in this?
Yeah. I got to Monterrey in 2007. I started arriving in Monterrey in the TDY capacity. I was assigned as the resident agent in charge. And before I officially reported, I was going intermittently, a month at a time, to get my feet wet and to learn the lay of the land, So I started getting there in 2007. And when I officially reported, my boss in Mexico City called me up for a meeting. And he basically gave me my marching orders and my assignment, which was your job is to take down the leader of the Zetas cartel and take him down and dismantle him. That's your job. I want you to focus on that, Leo. So that was what I did. That's what we did as a team down there in Monterrey. I mean, as a law enforcement officer, you need your team. You can't do anything on your own. So we went down there, and our team focused on those guys. And their leader was a guy named Heriberto Lascano, and his number 2 was a guy named Miguel Trevino, Z40. Now, Z40 was the most brutal criminal that anyone will ever come across. So our orders were to capture them, number 1, and to dismantle the cartel. And when you're given a mission like that, you can't do it overnight. It's just not going to happen. So there's a lot of planning involved to get to that level. And our strategy was to just chip away at the leadership structure in Monterrey, and that's what we tried to go. That was our game plan, and that's what we tried to follow while we were down there.
Now, I'm going to come back to Z40 because if I'm not mistaken, he's made the news within the last few months,
Right.
Being arraigned in the U.S.
Correct.
And we'll get into some of that. But before we get there, when you're talking about dismantling an entire organization and focusing on the leadership, without giving away too much, and I know in the book, you can address certain things, but was there something like a strategy already in place that you all in the DEA knew, hey, if we implement the exact same thing we did with this other organization, it'll work? Or were y'all starting to just create the strategy based off of the makeup of the leadership?
Well, I had a lot of experience, in my prior assignment in McAllen, Texas, with a lot of very experienced agents that I learned a lot from. A lot of mentors down here in McAllen. And when I was a rookie and I was working major cases with those guys, I learned how to go after a major trafficker. Obviously you're not going to do it overnight. It's going to take you a couple of years, but you got to build your way up to that level. So I learned a lot, and that strategy that they used here in the United States, well, I took it with me to Mexico, and I applied those same strategies to this organization, and it's a proven method. Once you take out their leadership structure, it's like a house of cards. It's going to fall eventually. So that was the strategy that we used, and that's the strategy that any investigator will use against an organization of this level, even a small one. It doesn't matter. It's the same strategy that you can use on a different scale, depending on who you're looking at. So I give credit to a lot of my mentors that taught us how to investigate somebody like that. So that's how we started off.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty good track record with the DEA toppling or dismantling, different drug empires, and that's and you've got that kind of history that you're building off of. So once leadership starts to get picked off or rolled up, were those operations then American charges all based off of DEA, based off of your team's cases, or were y'all also splitting that with anything to do with the Mexican government also arresting them on their own separate charges?
Well, when I was down there in Mexico, and mostly operations that you'll see that are in the book, that are outlined in the book, it was all Mexican charges pretty much. The only ones with American charges were the leaders, was Z40 and Lascano, and there was a couple of others that had some U.S. charges, but we were focused on those guys. The other guys, we pretty much let the Mexican government handle them. So, and there were plenty of charges that they had on them. One of the first guys that we took down, we seized nine tons of marijuana in a warehouse that he was overseeing. So, those are charges that were applied in Mexico, and the Mexican government was able to take care of that. So our focus was strictly on those two leaders, and the other guys, if they had charges in the U.S., sure, but mostly we let Mexico handle those charges against them. So that's how it worked.
Now, when y'all are working your operations down there, we know how TV depicts DEA overseas or in other countries. What is it actually like when you're in country in Mexico and you're operating there? Like, what type of things do you have in place? What type of weapons, up armored vehicles? Like, what, if you can talk about that, like what did you have or what did you not have?
Well, first of all, we're not allowed to carry firearms in Mexico. It's against the law. The country has strict laws against carrying firearms, and they apply to us as well. So we didn't have diplomatic immunity. So we're just a regular Joe down there. You know, we're not nobody special. So if you get caught with a gun on you in Mexico, you're going to jail. You know, there's just no way around it, no questions, and we're told that before we go there. So there's just no question. You can't say I didn't know, you know, because you're told before you go down there, and everybody knows that if you get caught with a gun, you're going to jail. So basically, we worked with the Mexican government, and it's not like TV, man, where you say, hey, you know, give me 5 wiretaps on these guys, and they have it done in like 5-10 minutes. That doesn't work that way, man. You know, there's a lot of mundane work that is done. You know, a lot of monotonous work, a lot of analysis of telephone calls and things like that, interviews that have to take place, things that they don't show on TV. You know, it took us, I don't know, the better part of 5 years to track down a Z40. So, you know, TV shows, they've got 2 hours to cram 5 years into that, you know, so they're not going to show the part where you're sitting at your desk going through phone tolls, man. So, you know,
well, and it's funny because I think for a lot of us growing up, we see TV, we see movies, or we read books that the books are often very accurate, but it's like when you watch the TV shows and the movies, that's what kind of gets people excited about like that level of work. But it's interesting, like then as we become adults, and some people maybe, you know, get into the field and they're still a little naive, but as adults, we still have that interest based off of what we saw. But the aspects, at least for most of the people that I worked with on the federal side and on the state side, once you get into like analysis, once you get into interviews, flipping informants, starting to see an overarching strategy,
right?
Like the running and gunning, I mean, can be fun, that sort of thing. But I always love when that switch got turned on and people realized, no, you can be on the winning end of all this. You could take any organization, like you were saying earlier. You have a strategy in place and you hammer away. You don't get frustrated or give up because it doesn't get done in 2 or 3 months. And I think for the average listener too, they have to kind of understand in the reality of dismantling organizations, it is a chess game. It is a long-term operation, and that does go on for years. But that's also how we are able to develop informants and sources and flip people, is because you can lay out the history of, like, no matter what the organization is, we don't go away. You're, you know, said organization is going to be dismantled. You as a person within this gang or this drug enterprise or this cartel, you have to decide at what point do you decide you're going to save yourself, because you know we're not going away. And for you with the DEA, hey, we have the full force of the U.S. government, you know, coming down on your organization. Are you going to cooperate? Are you going to lay down and do your time? Are you going to, you know, run and become a fugitive that we're going to track down in some other country, you know, and you hiding in a hole? So I don't know. Did you get to do some of the aspects of like that, of working sources within that organization or elsewhere, even going back through your background prior to?
Sure, you know, it's all part of it. It's all part of the game. It's all part of the. I like to use the analogy of climbing a mountain. You know, you start at the bottom, and you're not going to get there overnight, man. You know, you have to take little steps and get up there eventually. And that's what we did. And it involves sometimes, you know, sitting in your office and looking through tons of paperwork to get one clue, you know. So, and you know, while I'm doing that, maybe somebody else is interviewing a guy that got arrested somewhere and is willing to talk. Now, that was a difficult part because Z40 was such a violent individual, and these people were terrified of him. They would rather just go to jail than say anything. So that was one of the challenges that we met also. I mean, nobody wanted to talk because they were terrified. Because not only would he kill that one person, he'd kill their entire family. You know, this guy had no problem wiping out an entire family. So that was the fear that this guy instilled in these guys, and then it was really, really difficult to get them to say anything. So I'm going to say, 90% of the time they told us to pound sand because they'd rather go to jail than have their entire family wiped out. I mean, that's the kind of challenges that we met over there. But little by little, everything was pieced together so we can get to that top of that mountain, So, sometimes it might seem boring or mundane or monotonous, but we have to do it. It's just another step to get you up to the top of that mountain. So all of us knew that. We knew what we had to do, and we were committed to that goal, and that's very important as well. You have to have that commitment, to get to that goal.
Yeah, a lot of people, when I'm trying to explain to them the differences between a criminal who is all about money, or an organization that's main motivation is making money, and then an organization that's making money but also is thriving on violence, and like how to prioritize which one an department or agency is going to go after. So what sometimes is a very easy flip to develop sources or informants from within the organization becomes a complete nightmare, like you were talking about, where 90% of them know if they cooperate in any way, not only are they going to be killed, their entire family is going to be killed.
Right.
Which fortunately in America is not quite always the situation dealing with gangs and criminal organizations here within the 50 states. However, I think that trend sadly potentially can change or accelerate in the next 15 to 20 years based off of techniques that criminal organizations know works. And the more tentacles different cartels have within the U.S. now in a lot of states, sadly, I think those techniques will see a lot more, which we already are, seeing them in different areas in the U.S. We'll see a lot more here in the States mimicking that.
Well, one of the things that I've said in prior interviews is criminals are very creative. They're going to find ways to circumvent the system and to be successful and to reach their goal of making money or whatever it is their goal is. And they're very creative. And some of those guys are smart. I've said many times before, a lot of these guys could have been CEOs of a company, but they decided to go to the side of crime. And very intelligent people, very creative, but they use it for that goal, for the criminal. They have the criminal mind, and they're smart. They'll find ways to circumvent whatever it is that we're trying to do so that they can reach their goals. So, I mean, I've come across many individuals like that over my career.
Now, were they, if I'm not mistaken, they were utilizing some of the first footage, like first video recordings of tortures of their enemies or informants or that sort of thing. Can you talk some about like some of their first techniques and how that sort of became mainstream in other areas?
Sure. One of the things that they pioneered is using video as sort of a shock and awe type of tactic for other cartels, people that were maybe considering not being loyal to the organization, and for the general public, just to show this is what's going to happen if you don't do what we say. For instance, if a businessman didn't want to pay the protection fee, they burn his place down or whatever. But some of those videos were used for that purpose. And we're talking about beheadings on video, tortures and executions. These guys pioneered that technique, that strategy to instill fear in people. And that's one of the reasons I chose the title for my book is Reign of Terror, because that's what it was. They ruled with fear and terror, not just in Monterrey, but the entire country. And that's one of the ways they did it, by by videotaping some of their tortures and the executions and putting it out in public for the world to see. I just spoke to a guy who was in Afghanistan not too long ago. I spoke to him, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks ago. And he was telling me that when he was down there, he interviewed a guy and they asked him, well, how did you guys start doing this beheading stuff? He said, oh, we learned it from the Mexican cartels, man. That's what we did. So, I mean, that's how far reaching these guys have gone, so it's pretty incredible to think about it.
And that's the double-edged sword of the technology we have. You and I sitting here talking, seeing each other on the screen. We can open up a new tab on our laptop, pull up YouTube, and watch videos from all over the world.
Right.
And like you said, with criminals, they also learn, and terrorists learn and see what pressure applied to a community can do. Sadly, that's what I was saying earlier, like that gets replicated, that gets learned. And as one organization begins to dominate the criminal landscape, others are trying to figure out how did they do that? How did within 6 months, that organization take over our territory or our area that we've been operating in? And
right. So I'm sorry, but
no, go ahead.
A lot of these guys, like I said, these guys are smart and they want to use whatever they can to their advantage to make money or to advance their organization. And technology is one of them. And like I said before, some of these guys are smart. Some of these guys, and if they don't know, if they don't have that knowledge, they'll find somebody and they'll hire them or they'll make them do it for them. So they're not going to stop just because their knowledge is limited. They'll find somebody that has the knowledge and hire them or force them to do it for them. So
yeah,
that's the way it works.
So when we're talking about Z40 specifically,
yes,
and I mentioned earlier, his name pops up in the news and in Department of Justice public releases within the last few months of being arraigned on conspiracy to commit murder and other violent felony charges. And if I'm not mistaken, his brother as well. I could be wrong, right? But
it's him and his brother, correct?
And so you're talking about these guys that have kind of been the most violent or been the most targeted guys in that organization, and now being arraigned in the U.S. What kind of message does that send back to the guys individually that had operated with them, even though they've been fractured and the organization is kind of splintered and people have gone and joined other organizations? What message does that send to the rest of that kind of subculture down there?
Well, anytime you catch a guy that's at the level of Z40 and he gets sent to the United States to face justice, it sends a very strong message to these guys, because to them, this guy's like untouchable. He's like the supreme being, and because that's the type of fear he installed in these guys, in his followers, in his crew, right? So for him to be sent to the United States to face justice is a big deal. It's huge because it sends them a message. You're not untouchable. Not even Z40 is untouchable. I mean, when he was facing charges in Mexico before they brought him over here, he was threatening that he was almost at the point of being released before he got sent to the United States. So, why? Because he was threatening the judges, because there's more than one judge that oversees that case. He was threatening them, threatening their families, threatening to wipe out their entire families if they didn't let him go. So those are the types of threats that he was putting out, and he was almost to the point of getting released. I think most of the charges had been dismissed in Mexico, except for one or two. And he was on the verge of getting back out on the street before he got sent over here. So now he's facing, several charges. I really don't know what they are. And even if I did, I couldn't talk about it because he's getting ready to go to trial. So I don't want to do anything to mess that up. But he's facing the minimum of life in prison. And, if he does get that sentence, he's going to spend it in the Supermax in Colorado. So we're hoping that that's what happens eventually with him.
So, and that was going to be one of my questions is depending on a criminal's mindset and their environment that they adapt to, was that one of like his or some of those other guys, like was that one of their worst fears, was to get extradited into America and then have to serve time in an American prison system?
Absolutely. I mean, even the biggest criminal in the world, Pablo Escobar, did not want to come to the United States to face U.S. justice. I mean, none of those guys want to come over here because they know the game is over. Once you're here, it's over. And I've never seen a criminal at that level walk, other than maybe John Gotti, who got acquitted once, but then he was charged again, and he was eventually sent to jail. But people at this level, it's really hard for them to win in court. So they know that once they get over here, pretty much the game is over, and they know they're going to spend the rest of their lives in jail, in a small cell. So yeah, they do not want to come over here. Yeah.
And I asked that, and I know people listening are like, "Man, this dude's asking the dumbest questions." But when I asked that is because, like a street cop can get frustrated in America because they're arresting some of the same gang members over and over, and then you see guys that adapt to a jail while they're waiting trial, and then they adapt to the yard or to state prison, and for depending on what gang they're in, it is kind of like coming home. They get to reunite with guys. They control the yard. There's not always an opposing threat because they have the numbers or they dominate. So I asked that question mainly because of that, because it is different for different organizations and then different levels when people are being extradited from different countries. Because that is the frustrating thing. But once a unit knows, hey, this is one of the key things or one of the fears that this leader in a criminal organization has, then we can capitalize on that. We can also capitalize on that in order to flip subordinates or other people moving up through the ranks and use that as an example of, remember Z40? Now he's extradited. Now he's in America. This is only going to keep happening to, leadership or to different people within the organization. But I had to kind of clarify that because I can hear people in my head, as not.
I understand it must be really frustrating to arrest the same guy every year or so, and have him come out and be doing the same thing. It must be very frustrating. But
that's one,
doing what we gotta do, man.
And that's why when I'm teaching my courses and training people, it's explaining, when you know what it is, like I said earlier, you can capitalize on that. So like in America, there were, street level gangs, and pick any of them, Orphans 13, MS 13, the list goes on. When these guys were getting arrested and then identified that they had actually been born in another country, and then they were facing deportation. This has gone over, at least my entire career, because of the area I worked in, the city I worked in. We had a large population of different Sereno cliques. And then eventually we got some Norteños, but for the most part, there were just a lot of different gangs claiming, Southsider status or 13 status. But when they were facing deportation, they would try to cooperate as best they could often. And so that was like to see that flip where a lot of those guys had been in America since they were 5 or 6 or 10 years old, and then they kind of came up through the ranks in the criminal organization. That was their fear. They were not always, worried about going to local jail or to state prison, but that idea of being deported back to a country where oftentimes the guys would tell me, like, I don't have ties there anymore. Like my mom and dad brought me here to America. Like, I don't even remember coming to America, kind of thing. Yeah. I used to have like deep conversations with some dudes because I wanted them to feel horrible about their choices to join a gang and then destroy communities and shoot some of the guys that they grew up with, or went to school with. And this idea of you kind of had it all. Your parents, working 2-3 jobs to provide a better life for you, and you had it. And all you had to do was go to school and work and treat people with respect and help in your community. Instead, you get jumped in. Now you're carrying a gun. Now you're shooting these dudes, and now you're hitting innocent citizens. And then now, kids are getting shot and grandparents. Like you've made all these horrible choices. And now, you've been identified and located, and now you're going to get deported. And
Right.
your family's going to miss out on you, and vice versa. You're going to miss out on your family. But understand, you did all that. Nobody else did that. You did it to yourselves. And it's almost like when some of these guys would slow down a little bit and get out of that day-to-day survival mode, some of them would cry, some of them would show remorse. And that was the side that I enjoyed working gangs, because some of those dudes did change their trajectory. Not necessarily dudes that were getting deported. I'm going to come back to that. But some of the guys that aged out and kind of started to understand the city we lived in had so many opportunities to just have a legitimate job and have really good money. They didn't have to stay in that lifestyle.
Right.
I kind of go off on a tangent, but it's one of those things that, as the listeners, sometimes people will ask me questions and they merge all these worlds, and it's kind of like these are two separate worlds in that sense. And guys that join any Southsider clique or whatever, sometimes are joining for different reasons than Zetas were, creating their organization.
Yeah, a lot of times these and I think it transfers over to gangs. What I saw in Mexico with the Zetas is they target young folks that are vulnerable, that are high risk, considered high risk. So they target them because they're easy targets, and they recruit them, recruit them into the Zetas organization, and they start getting a little bit of money and contributing to whatever, buying their girlfriend gifts, or actually having a car or something like that, something that they never would have had otherwise. So that's how they find them. They recruit them. They look for these high risk youth, teenagers, and they recruit them. And I think it transfers over to the United States as well. They look for these vulnerable individuals that they can recruit easily, and have them have a sense of belonging into a group. So that I think they use that to their advantage as well.
Yeah, I think too that part of the strategy, depending on what your resources are, as like you're taking out leadership, also having part of that being to sort of deplete the incoming recruits. Like, can you do it? Can you make strategic arrests and focus on like destroying the brand, so to speak, like create that environment of you don't want to be on the losing team, which is sad. I mean, like you said, if the organization is targeting younger recruits and they know who to go after to recruit them and to entice them, that recruit also has a willingness, in a sense, to want to join that organization. I know sometimes it's by force, but I'm also saying that there are people who will seek out a very certain criminal organization because that brand, that name is so synonymous with money and power and respect, right? So it's go ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately, in Mexico, a lot of the music is geared at glorifying some of these narco traffickers, and there's a lot of songs that glorify these guys, and I have money and cars and horses and all these girls after me and stuff, so they see that and they think, well, wow, I want to have that lifestyle, and that's another thing that makes them easier to recruit, because they see that in the music and the music videos and stuff like that. So it just makes it a lot easier for them to recruit these kids. So but that's the way it works.
I think people should also pay attention to the power of music in that sense, that, you can, as a young teenager or even like a kid. I mean, when I really started paying attention to music, I was 9, 10 years old. and really, reading lyrics and understanding what was going on. But people kind of oftentimes dismiss that power. So it's easy for like a news outlet or somebody in America to be in front of a news camera screaming that, rap music is causing kids to join gangs. And people are like, oh, that's crazy. You can't blame the music. But the music can directly influence. I saw it. And you, like you just talked about, like once you see it, it's not as simple as people want to make it. It's complex in that sense that like the music is attractive to the ear, and then the message, and then sometimes people look at it like they would a horror movie or something, and they go, okay, the killer's killing all these people. Oh, it's a scary movie. They don't necessarily want to go be a serial killer,
Right.
But
Exactly.
but like listening to that music, sometimes when people hear it, they're drawn into it, and then it starts to become this glamorous way. And sadly, you see it. I mean, within a year or two, kids are really, kind of engulfed in this music, and then they start mimicking that lifestyle, and then they get a little closer and a little closer. And I can only imagine in an environment where funds or resources are, being diminished, or job markets are crumbling, or a kid grows up on a farm or a ranch or anything, and then all of a sudden here's about this kind of big money lifestyle and
Sure.
girls, and it isn't wild how all of that has kind of run simultaneously, America and Mexico, like with that proliferation of cartels, gangs in the US, and then now kind of the blending of the two, in the sense that I started seeing it on a smaller scale, obviously, but in our city, not the state. Our state had a few larger cartel investigations, just not within my city. But we started to see and do debriefs with different gang members who had been deported. And it started with one guy I talked to. He had been deported to Mexico. And when he came back across the border, like to get smuggled back in, basically, or to get, back in, the people that he was willing to pay or he had access to or whatever was a cartel. And so they recognized the tattoos. They knew what they were doing, and they just kind of played him. They explained to him, once you get back to your city, then, you understand who we are. You understand our power. But we have the connects. We have Coke. We have, everything that you need and more. And you also know that when you or anybody in your clique or your gang gets deported, then potentially we're going to be the ones getting you back across the border, that sort of thing. So that network gets established, unfortunately, when gang members were getting deported. And what I had realized from that debrief, and then some other information coming in, is that one of the gangs we had in the city was all about the connection with the cartel.
Right.
And it was Sinaloa, if I remember right. And that was the push for that gang. Another gang that had a really good source in, he had a similar experience, but it was very negative. I don't want to go into too many details, but he had witnessed the effects in an area of Mexico to someone that goes against the cartel.
Yeah.
He did not like that. He did not like that level of violence. He was fine with shooting someone or a fight or maybe a stabbing someone. What he did not want is an entire terror campaign going on in the city. But then, as a gang, we're trying to design our strategies to dismantle certain gangs. It was like, our future problem is going to be this, but right now, this gang is pushing for these connects with cartels, while this one is avoiding it. So it's good because this gang, we don't necessarily have to prioritize right now. This one that wants the cartel connect and they're pushing that's who needs to get some focus of strategic arrest, and that sort of thing, of having to kind of pick and choose who to go after. But the more I spoke on that in different gang intel meetings and briefings, the more information I would start to get back from other officers and detectives saying, hey, I started asking around too, and this is what we're seeing in this area or this region. So I say that to say all of over, at least for the southern states in the U.S., we've seen that explosion because of some of those pathways. And that it only continues the more gangs are spreading in the U.S. and the more powerful cartels are in Mexico. Now, I'm going to switch gears real quickly. When you mentioned Pablo Escobar earlier,
Right.
so when cartels were getting dismantled in Colombia throughout, the mid '90s and that sort of late '80s, mid '90s, did that cause a vacuum that then allowed Mexican cartels to start to dominate some of those drug markets, or am I off on that?
Well, you know what? The Colombia and a lot of those countries in South America have always been suppliers of cocaine to the Mexican cartels. I mean,
Mhm.
did it create a vacuum? Maybe for a little while, but not for long, because there's always somebody else that's going to step up. And many of the guys that we investigated when I was down in Mexico, some of those guys, their source of supply was not Colombian. They were from Peru, they were from
Mhm.
Bolivia, they were from other countries. So, and then I'm talking 20 tons of cocaine at a time that they would bring in. So,
Mhm.
it's big quantities that were manufactured in South America, not necessarily Colombia all the time. So
Mhm.
it may have created a vacuum for just a little while, and then it started on. You're probably even stronger than before. So that yeah, I mean, like I say, these guys are creative. Their goal is to make money, millions and millions of dollars.
Mhm.
They're gonna find a way to make it work.
Yeah. So now for you, when you started getting into the DEA, like I'm
Sure.
gonna back up a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go
You
back.
didn't just like wake up one day and say I want to be a DEA agent and it happened. I mean, there were
No.
some steps involved, but you have a pretty interesting background in how you got involved in the DEA. If you can kind of like just kind of walk us through how that happened for you.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town called Brownsville, Texas. It's here on the border with Matamoros, Mexico. And Matamoros, Mexico, is the birthplace of the Gulf Cartel. Now, the godfather of the Gulf Cartel was a guy named Juan N, the letter N, Guerra. Guerra, when it's translated into English, means war. So
Mm,
Juan Guerra, he was the founder of what is now the Gulf Cartel, and he started off, back in the Prohibition days, bootlegging whiskey and stuff like that. And then when Prohibition ended, well, they had to find other ways of making money, So he didn't really start out right away in the drug business, but as time went on, his nephew, a guy by the name of Juan Garcia Abrego, in the late '70s, mid '80s, took over, and he started moving marijuana, and he made the connection. He's the first trafficker in Mexico to make the connection with the Colombian cartel, and
mm,
he made it with the Cali cartel. He's the one that started bringing in large amounts of cocaine into Mexico and distributing it to the United States. And it all happened in the '80s. Uh, I was a kid growing up, and I was right across from Matamoros. And of course, as a kid, I didn't know none of this was going. I had no clue what DEA was.
mm,
I grew up. My dad was a musician. Music has played a big role in my life. And when I was going to school, my major in college was English, the English literature. I started out wanting to be an English teacher. And why?
mm,
Because in Brownsville, Texas, and on the border, there's a lot of kids that had problems with English. I mean, a lot of them were from Mexico, and they couldn't speak English. And I wanted to teach those kids so that they could assimilate into our community and and function, with the English language, because some of them couldn't speak anything other
mhm.
than hi and thank you and stuff like that. So that was my goal as a young man. I wanted to teach these kids, and first of all, I love reading. So I majored in English literature, And as I was in college, my mom was working in a law firm, and her coworker was married to a DEA agent. And we're talking about the mid 1980s. And he started recruiting me at the time because
Mm.
DEA was looking for more Hispanic agents. Now that the guys like Juan Garcia Abrego were moving more cocaine into the United States, you're talking about guys that are based on the border. The Gulf Cartel had from Matamoros all the way almost up to what's called Eagle Pass, Texas, which is a huge area, and they controlled all that area. So they were bringing in coke, I mean, by the tons, multi tons at a time, you know. So DEA was looking for more Hispanic agents to do undercover deals and translate, you know, intercepted telephone calls and stuff like that. So he started recruiting me, and we're talking about 1985. And in 1985, obviously, for those that don't know, 1985, February the 7th, 1985, Enrique Camarena was kidnapped in Guadalajara, Mexico, as he was leaving the U.S. consulate to go meet his wife for lunch. And, you know, the rest is pretty much history. Enrique Camarena was tortured and killed, and he's become an icon for DEA and law enforcement all over the world. So that incident happened in 1985, and I was in my senior year in college. And that's when I pretty much decided that I wanted to be a DEA agent. And the man who recruited me, his name is, he passed away. His name is Tony Tamayo. I asked him, hey, Mr. Tamayo, you know, I'm majoring in English. I'm not a law enforcement, you know, criminal justice major. He goes, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You can just get your degree. And once you get your degree, you apply for DEA, and we'll see what happens then. And that's what I did. And I got the call. It took about a year for DEA to finally say, yes, you've been accepted for the job. Do you accept it? I almost fell on my knees and said yes. You know, so.
Yeah.
So I got the call in December of 86. February of 1987, I was in the academy in Quantico, Virginia.
Mm.
So that's how I became a DEA agent. But no, I didn't wake up one day and say, I want to be a DEA agent.
Yeah.
You know, it happened over time. And one of the major points was the Camarena kidnapping that made me decide to go ahead and join DEA. You know, so I have no regrets, you know. And I think I told this story on Steve Murphy's show when I was in my senior year in college. One of the bands, I was a musician myself. You know, my father was a musician, and I put myself through college with my music and playing in a band and stuff like that. So one of my dream bands when I was a senior in college on my last semester said, we're going on a U.S. tour. We need a keyboard player. We want you to come with us and go on tour, man. So, and I was like, man, I got 3 months left before I get my bachelor's degree. Should I say yes or just finish out my degree and apply for DEA? And well, I turned them down, man. I turned them down, and I finished my degree and I joined DEA, and here I am, man. So who knows what would have happened if I would have said yes? I don't know if I'd be here today. So
it's like the opposite. You know, usually you hear like a musician say, I turned down this great paying job to stick it out on tour with the band, and hey, it paid off. I don't know that I've heard like the reverse where someone's like, I turned down the band to join the DEA or any department, really.
Yeah,
Now,
but I have
now
no
you,
regrets.
yeah.
No regrets at all, man. No regrets. You know.
Now, real quickly, you mentioned Steve Murphy, and so a lot of listeners know about Pablo Escobar. They know about the DEA's investigation down there, you know, going back into the late 80s, early 90s. The funny side story is for years, I didn't watch a whole lot of TV because of work schedule and that sort of thing. So the series Narcos came out. I think there's 3 seasons. So my wife and I were talking, and I'm like catching up on television now. So she had mentioned a while back about Narcos, and then I'm like, yeah, I just never watched the show, but I read, you know, Murphy Pena's book and the Killing Pablo book. I said, so yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated with the topic. He's like, oh, we got to watch the show. We got to watch it. So we've been watching it like sometimes 2 or 3 episodes a night. for the last few weeks. And so it's one of those things where, and when I told her, I was like, man, like so far the show seems pretty accurate in the sense of like the timeline and,
Yeah.
The way things are going, at least based on the books. What do I know? But it's interesting though when you mention Murph's podcast, because that's how I heard about you. I was listening to an episode and telling her, I was like, hey, I started listening to Murph's podcast, and I was telling her about you. But it was just that thing of where it's cool to see a team, they work, they have their career, and then kind of in what everybody calls like the afterlife. Once you retire, what do you do then? And he's got these episodes, and like when you were on there, that was like one of the things that stuck out. Obviously, your work and cartels and stuff, but was when y'all were talking and kind of telling stories back and forth, how just laid back he is. You know what I mean? Like, and you are too. And that's to me, that's always the draw. Like, I really love when people are approachable. They don't have these huge egos,
right,
in that sense, like personal egos, but can tell a funny story or that sort of thing, or use like their podcast for good, so to speak. And that I do want to speak on that. Like I've been impressed so far with the few episodes I've been able to listen to with him. But I love that. I love this format. I love for guests to be able to come on and talk and to explain their backgrounds and like how they got into whatever field it is. I mean, I've had guests on that were former Nazi skinheads. I've had guys that have done prison time, gang members, undercover agents, writers, and I've had a bunch of musicians. I've had different bands and stuff because I love all these different kind of guests or backgrounds. But so for you with music and getting kind of motivated within to join DEA, and I think that kind of speaks to also, we get pulled into this type of field, this type of craft. I think usually most of us internally, there's just this like drive, this something. People will often be like, well, quit cheesing it up and saying it's a calling and this and that's just a job. but it's not, you know what I mean? And you know that, but I'm saying like, it's not just a job. And I think that's one of those things that in retirement, when we can do things that we enjoy, you've got your book, you speak, like these things that we do to kind of pass on that knowledge to motivate that next generation. I kind of go off on a tangent a little bit there, but I do want to say that to me is a measure of success for podcast and for people when they retire, or even people when they leave law enforcement after 10 or 15 years, but they're doing something to kind of contribute to passing on that knowledge, or at least explaining how some of the investigations went, that sort of thing. So I do like that. And I don't know, I enjoyed that episode. And when I realized when you were talking about your book, I was like, thank you for writing a book. Like that's, I believe that a lot of Americans are, let's say they're not reading, but they're taking in books like auto book format,
right.
But I do believe that nonfiction books about criminal organizations will always be craved by the American populace.
Well, I just came back from a conference. It's the Texas Narcotics Officers Association conference, and I met people from all over Texas and all over the U.S. Some from California, from Arkansas, and different parts of the U.S., Colorado, and a lot of these guys are hungry for that knowledge. They and a lot of people are not familiar with who the Zetas were. Even though they are in law enforcement and narcotics law enforcement, you have people that just don't know. They don't know the story. And like I told many of them, when you hear of Mexican cartels, the first person that pops into your mind is Chapo Guzman. He's not the only game in town. And these guys, the Zetas, they wanted to kill Chapo Guzman, and they came pretty close several times. So there's several stories out there. Everybody has a story, but I feel the public needs to know who these guys were. and what they did and the atrocities they committed and our challenge in going after them and dismantling that cartel.
And I agree with you, especially right now in current times, because, and I think we had mentioned it earlier, but with America, the State Department designating Zetas as a foreign domestic terrorist group, that then opens the door to different operations, different assets, and a different strategy
Sure.
moving forward. And, you know, because we all carry around, most of us, these devices, these iPhones and whatever, these mobile devices, and we're getting constant, inundated messages
Right.
of what we're supposed to think and how we're supposed to riot or not riot or hate our government or love our government or, all these things. I'm starting to kind of see that as well, that people are being outspoken about the American government should not be doing this, and this is a power move and this sort of thing. But a lot of those opinions, I think, are coming from people who, one, are raised in a very safe neighborhood, never really experienced someone getting shot or killed in their neighborhood or within eyesight of their residence, and citizens who have no full knowledge or understanding about how cartels operate and how the border and the wars that are going on back and forth. But they're being told, through different
Sure.
messages and that echo chamber. And that's one of those things that where when I talk to people and I can say, hey, put all of that stuff aside and just read a book, just focus on the level of violence, understand that. And that's what I was talking about earlier. These cartels are not street gangs. And that's
No.
what, I try to explain to people. Like when you have a cartel that is hanging people from bridges or, quartering up bodies or allowing certain cuts and incisions and filming vultures, dismantling bodies and then showing it to people, that's a whole new level of terror. And I think that once the average citizen fully understands, okay, this is not just a couple of guys selling a little bit of drugs. Like these organizations have a goal of controlling, infiltrating political government, police departments. So they are in total control.
Right.
So I say that to say that with your book, that's what I would want people to read your book and several others that I recommend often. So they at least have that working knowledge, and then they can still criticize the government, that sort of thing, or criticize decisions. I believe in critical thinking, but it's that idea of you do have to know the enemy, so to speak. You have to know the organization and how they're operating to at least to make an opinion. Don't just echo what people are telling you to do. And I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but now that status, in the last few months, when that status changes, the future is going to change. Like, I think that kind of opens the door to different assets, like I said. And if the strategy is to deal with it the way terror organizations have been dealt with in the past by the U.S. government, it's going to be a very different news feed, I think, in the coming years if things continue to escalate.
Well, here's why I'm happy that they finally designated the cartels as terrorist organization, and I'll give you a small example, and it's really not a small example.
Mm-hmm.
This guy Z40 Miguel Trevino, and it's not in my book. I didn't tell this story in my book because if I tell every single story that of the atrocities Miguel Trevino committed, I would still be writing. So
Mm-hmm.
as it is, it took me 6 years to write this book. So anyway, there's a town on the border of Mexico called Allende, and there was some people that worked for Miguel Trevino that were based in that town, and they decided to cooperate with DEA. Okay, make a long story short, he found out, and he went looking for those people in that town. Couldn't find them because they had already left, and they had gone to the United States and took their families. But they went and they looked for these people, and if you were a friend of his or associated with these people in any way, you got kidnapped, and they took you to this barn, and they rounded up. Just to make a long story short, they rounded up 300 people and killed them all, and then burned them all. They tore down houses with bulldozers. They'd go into a house looking for these people, and the maids and the yard workers and people like that were picked up and killed. This guy wiped out almost an entire town. Is that terroristic? Of course it is. I mean, he wiped out an entire town. He even killed their pets. He even killed their dogs. This is crazy. I mean, all because, okay, you're a friend of this guy that I'm looking for. Come with me. You're gonna get killed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So I mean that's what terrorists do, and I'm glad they named them as a terrorist organization, because they should have done this a long time ago. So
why? I mean, without putting you on the spot, but I kind of am like, why do you think it took so long?
politics. It's all politics.
Mhm.
I don't know. I in the past, I think there was some kind of apprehension of naming them terrorists, because they don't want to sour relations with Mexico, but it has to be done, because these guys are just operating with impunity. And I've talked to many people in Mexico, and they're just tired. They're tired of the violence, and above all, they're tired of the impunity. That's what I'm sorry, excuse my friend, pisses them off more. Impunity. The government does not do anything. So they're tired of it, and I think they welcome this designation, hoping that the U.S. will come in and actually do something and make Mexico peaceful again, because Mexico's a beautiful country. Don't get me wrong. I loved my time there. Guadalajara is a beautiful city. Monterrey is a beautiful city. Mexico City it's awesome. But you can't take your kids to the park without worrying about these guys, coming up and engaging in a shootout, and you're going to get caught in a crossfire, or they're going to kidnap one of your kids or something. It's crazy. So that at some point has to stop. Because it's a beautiful country. There are neighbors to the south. So something has to be done, and I'm glad they finally did this. They took this step, and hopefully it'll lead to some progress there.
Yeah, I do feel like and I'm making notes. So when y'all see me looking down, I'm like making notes, because I'm glad you brought that up. I think that this decision and this movement now is going to make things, or relations with America and Mexico, better in that sense. I don't understand, or I don't want to see any of the negative effects of that, because just like you had said, like when citizens are sick of the violence,
right?
And it's the exact same thing. Like you said, it would be the exact same thing to be overseas in Afghanistan or in Iraq, 10 years ago or less than that, and seeing families being executed because of their connections to their support. It's the exact same thing. The techniques work on citizens because it's all based in fear and instilling that. I think that if the two countries are working together and there is a direct stream of people being arrested or located in Mexico and then extradited into America, like we saw with Z40, and continuing to do that, as well as complete pressure on those organizations and citizens seeing it firsthand, seeing less and less violence, I think that then just kind of brings it back to what I like to think of, like, growing up and it feeling like America and Mexico were, like neighbors, like two houses that live on the same street, like you can have cookouts and hang out and talk, and so what oftentimes looks like to the average citizen of whatever overreaching, overstepping, I don't think in this case that's what it is. I believe that this is the best position moving forward, and I think that this is what's going to help bring peace to a lot of areas in Mexico and along the U.S. and in border towns that have seen the same thing, the rise in violence that's directly related to cartels, to smuggling, and that sort of thing. So that's one of those things that I am glad that that's happening, and I feel like this is going to be a good thing moving forward. So I do want people to do more research, read up more about those techniques and why the status changed to identifying them as a terrorist organization, because it needs to be done. And I also want that precedent being set to any other criminal organizations that are affecting other countries as well. I mean, that same thing can be replicated if there's another organization, rising to power and doing the exact same thing.
Right. I was recently
Because we
asked.
don't, yeah.
I was recently asked on an interview about the situation in Venezuela with Nicolás Maduro, and they say,
Mhm.
well, "Have you ever seen a president of a country being treated this way?" And I said, first of all, Nicolás Maduro is not recognized as a president by our government right now, and second of all, he's a criminal. And what do we as an organization, as DEA, I'm talking specifically about DEA, just like I told you in the beginning of the interview, we employ our strategy. Nicolás Maduro is a criminal. We're going to employ that same strategy on him. We're going to close his circle of communication, his finances, everything that affects him, to close that circle on him until either he gives up or something happens, or we get a location on him and pick him up. But that's what the U.S. is doing right now with this guy. So I see success in the future in that world, in Venezuela, and I hope it does happen, because this guy has been a dictator down there for many, many years, and again, the people of Venezuela are tired of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the principle applies to criminals all over the world. So I hope to see some success in that arena.
Yeah, I met a guy. This has been several years ago. We were working a murder, and just you're talking to people in the neighborhood, doing a canvas, that sort of thing. But just talking to a guy, he had nothing to do with witnessing the crime. But as you're doing a canvas and talking to people, you also you keep an open ear and let people talk. So it had nothing to do with the actual investigation. But the poor guy, I say poor, he actually wasn't poor. He was doing really good for himself. Very nice truck in the driveway. But what he started telling me, because he was just wanting to vent, is that he had moved from Venezuela. It had taken him years to get his citizenship in the U.S.
Yeah.
And he was so afraid, because at that time, now you're talking about whatever, 3 or 4 years ago, but Biden was the president, and there were riots going on, and there was just like so much upheaval in cities and on the news, that this guy was deathly afraid that he had worked so hard to leave Venezuela and socialism and that sort of, or communism, that sort of thing. He was so afraid that was going to happen in America. And
Right.
and it like broke my heart. I'm like, please, man, do me a favor. Stop watching so much news and just understand, America does this from time to time, and things happen, but you got a good life. You did everything right. America is going to still stay a free country, and again, back to those devices in our hands, like he's seeing these news stories, and it was starting to chip away at his own resolve. Like, no, man, like, please hang in there. But he was telling me about that, like what it was like in Venezuela, and to see government control, and to see people's spirit be crushed. And I think that so many Americans who are very vocal and want to jump to the support of dictators and to communism or socialism, I don't care what you call it. At the end of the day, the motivation is destroyed for the individual. So it can be socialism or communism. There's no effort to really want to work and have a better life in that sense. So I hate when things like that happen. And for that guy, I only hope that now he feels a little bit better, seeing some things changing, seeing that, Americans just want a solid economy, and they don't want crime, and they actually don't want other countries to have dictators and torturing their citizens. You
Right,
know,
sure.
it's wild. We're all human beings. You know, we don't.
So
We just.
aside from being a dictator, he's a drug trafficker. You know, he's been trafficking tons and tons of cocaine into the United States. So he's a criminal. You know, hiding behind his position there. So and I'm glad that they're treating him that way, and they're applying that same strategy to him as they would just any other criminal.
Yeah. So when and that kind of like it starts to bring up examples of different, you know, Panama in '89 and
Right.
Noriega, and like how all these governments and trafficking cartels and stuff start to become kind of interwoven. Did you see with whether Zetas or anyone else where cartels were starting to make connections directly with Hezbollah or Hamas or any of these other, or ISIS or any of these organizations where you could actually, and if you can't speak on it, please don't. I'm curious from my own perspective if there are direct ties linked to stuff like that, similar to Noriega and cocaine trafficking back in the day. But
No, I personally never saw that in Mexico. I can't say that I did. You know, and they were pretty much just self-sufficient. You know, they didn't need that. They didn't need that. They had their own organization with thousands and thousands of people. So no, I never saw that. If it was there, I really never saw it. So
yeah, it's one of those things that comes up, and a lot of people will, I don't know, kind of mix the two. And that's what I always try to say is like, I didn't work the border. I didn't work organizations down there, but I've sat in on briefings or talked to people who have. And if you have a presence of Hamas or Hezbollah or insurgents getting stopped at the border, may or may not have cartel connections, but either way, they're flowing in and out of different regions of the country and coming across borders, Canada and Mexico. So it's always that like that idea of you always want to keep organizations and people from intermingling like that, because then it just becomes a new dragon that you have to kind of slay of, okay, now they're pulling their resources the exact same way we would do if we're going to go after an organization. It's like, okay, well, who are their known enemies? How many informants do we have in those organizations? Okay, well, now let's start focusing our debriefs with those informants and sources, all focused on this organization. So while we're pulling our resources and dismantling this group, we don't want them doing the same thing and making connections with people outside of their region or people that have access to better weaponry or bomb making techniques or whatever. So
yeah, fortunately we never saw that, and I just don't really see it happening, you know, right now at this moment. So.
Yeah. Would you say the current status in 2025 compared to 2015 over these last 10 years, would you say that overall cartels, that the violence has escalated, tripled, quadrupled, or is it becoming so fragmented it's kind of hard to track?
Oh, no, it's definitely escalated, you know, and numbers don't lie. You know, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but with every year you can see those numbers escalating. You know, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but every year the homicide numbers escalate every year since I left, you know, Mexico. So yeah, it's definitely increasing. Some of them are not reported. That's even worse, you know.
Yeah.
These are just the homicides and violent crimes that are reported. Some of them go unreported and we never even know about them. So but yeah, it has definitely escalated. And right now, you know, there's two factions of the Sinaloa cartel at war, and every day you're seeing violence and killings and murders. You know, so yeah, it has definitely escalated.
Yeah. Again, that's a question I asked that I thought I was pretty sure it had escalated, but you know, there's always going to be a spin or people outside of this realm that'll say, oh, well, you know, whatever, you know, 5 years ago or 6 years ago in Mexico is a different president and there was a different push, and you know, cartel violence is down. And while I like numbers and data sometimes, because if I'm talking to someone who's numbers driven and I have to prove a point to them, I will revert to numbers. But we also, like you said, we know murder rates can show you one thing. Shots fired and people getting
Sure.
shot but surviving shows you also a whole nother level of violence too. But
Well, when I was there, the president was Felipe Calderón, and towards the initial part of Enrique Peña Nieto.
mhm,
When Felipe Calderón, a lot of people put blame on Felipe Calderón for escalating this war on drug traffickers in Mexico. But if you take the numbers with Felipe Calderón's administration and then Peña Nieto and then AMLO, with each administration after Calderón, the numbers go up.
mhm,
Why? Calderón escalated the war, yes, and he took them on, toe to toe. But then when Peña Nieto came in, he de-escalated that war. And then
mhm.
when AMLO came on as president, he totally just said, we're not at war anymore with these guys. So what happens? The homicide rate increases. And with this new president, she has the same philosophy as AMLO. So it's increasing. With every administration, it has increased ever since Calderón left office. So yeah, it does make a difference.
Which that's on the same trajectory with American cities, like some of the chiefs coming forward and saying we don't have a gang problem, or hey, we're doing less proactive policing and we're only going to react because that's what the citizens want. And so it's just interesting when that's going on, those same cities that kind of pushed less proactive policing and dismantled their gang units and their
Yeah.
drug units and street crimes units, miraculously, not really, I'm being sarcastic, but that violent crime is just spiked. It's like, yeah, I'm sitting in briefings talking to higher ups and talking to prosecutors, and like, I'm telling you, this works. You have to put pressure on organizations. You have to put pressure on locations. There's got to be heavy arrest, very strategic. If you send a message that there is no gang problem and that we're not going to have units that are going to go after them, they get emboldened. And how do I know that? Because I got the recordings and I've listened to informants inside of meetings and that sort of thing. And they are saying that it's like a field day because they realize the pressure is off. And when they go to their monthly meetings and they sit down and they're talking about the drama within the organization, they go, like, basically they're kind of laughing that there's not a bunch of arrests, that people are not going to federal prison on gun charges. And so it does make them emboldened, and the recruiting drive picks up because now nobody's going to prison. So when people are interested in joining that organization, it's a great sales pitch to be like, our people aren't locked up. Our people aren't doing life in prison. Nobody cares anymore about us. The police are just going to sit back in a parking lot and do nothing. But then the cities are the jurisdictions that doubled down and went heavy and said, we're going to keep our gang units. We're going to keep our drug units. We're going after this. We're going after cartels. We're going after drug traffickers. That violence did not escalate. Now, numbers wise, I can pull those charts up. So that's where people start to go, oh, okay. But you and I both know that. It's like when these techniques work, the next administration or the next police chief or sheriff, whether it's Mexico's president or whether it's here in America in the cities, keep on that gas. Like, just keep the pedal down. It works until you do topple these organizations and you do get a good foothold in those areas. And then that next generation doesn't want to join that, or maybe it's not as enticing to them because these guys are not running around in decked out vehicles and having all this money. You're really rebranding them basically as being the losing team. So
Right.
that's why, yeah, like I'm glad you spoke on that, because oftentimes people, when they're studying crime, they're reading stats and that sort of thing, and not always fully understanding what it is to condition the criminal. And when I say criminal, you know what I mean, like the career criminal, to condition them. You're going to be on the losing end. There's no way you're not going to end up in prison or the grave living this kind of lifestyle, or you choose to leave it. Like, not everybody gets to lay down their rifle and walk away from a cartel, but
Right. So they have to see that there's going to be severe consequences,
mm-hmm.
and that kind of serves as a deterrent to whatever they want to do. I mean, when I was in Mexico with Calderon, I mean, they know, hey, sooner or later we're going to find you, and either you're going to be killed in a shootout or you're going to be in jail. There's going to be some consequences, and it got to a point where the Marines, after a certain hour at night at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, they're just picking everybody up and questioning them, and that had consequences. We heard on the street from our informants, hey, these guys are afraid now, man. They're afraid to go out because the Marines are picking people up. And, so it had consequences. It struck fear in them, So I truly believe that. And when you, like you say, you take your foot off that gas pedal, they're gonna say, okay, now things are cool now, and now we can go back out of the streets, So nothing's gonna happen. So you got to keep your foot on that pedal. And I was asked this question recently on another interview from a show in Mexico. What is the solution? I say, you gotta fight fire with fire. These guys don't know any other way. The criminals in Mexico, they don't know any other way. If you don't show them that there's going to be consequences, they're going to walk all over you. Easy.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Man, I appreciate your time today. I know we talked a little over an hour, so I want to be respectful of your time, but I also want you to be able to tell the listeners where they can get your book, how they can contact you. I got some pretty nice listeners who really take an interest in this type of stuff. So what's the best way they can reach you?
So the best way, and you can get all my social media accounts, is on my website. It's leosilvaauthor.com. And you can order the book from there if you want. There's plenty of interviews that I've done previously that are on there. And this one will be on there once it drops. I'll put it on my website. So that's the easiest way. And you can send me a message through there, through email. And all my social media accounts are on that website. So that's the easiest way to get a hold of me and to get the book and access the interviews.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, buddy, I appreciate it, man.
Well, thank you for having me on, man. It's a pleasure.
Yes, sir. Take care, buddy.
All right. Take care, man. Thanks.